Hey folks, today I wanted to go through three clips from renowned YouTube skeptic Alex O'Connor. Alex is probably familiar to you as an extremely smart and thoughtful skeptic. He's more than a skeptic, he's an atheist, but unlike many atheists, he's taken the time and undergone the study to dig into religion, specifically Christianity, philosophy, which is his background, and even some science. So, the purpose of this video will be to respectfully demonstrate how poor evidence or even lack of evidence can lead to bad assumptions, which lead to faulty conclusions. So, here we go. So, to kick this off, we're going to join Alex in a discussion about free will.
Alex O'Connor, would you briefly describe why you don't believe that free will exists? And first of all, if you don't mind just kind of defining the terms, what do we mean by free will and determinism?
Sure, yes.
Just in a few minutes.
I can try my best. Free will is a complicated subject in many ways, but it's also incredibly simple. It's a bit like consciousness in the fact that it's simultaneously the most mysterious, mystifying thing in the world, the greatest mystery that scientists and philosophers have been battling about for centuries and more. But at the same time, the most obvious and straightforward thing in the world because you interact with the world through it.
Just want to pause here to second the fact that consciousness is truly one of the most confounding issues for scientists. Our understanding of consciousness is primitive at best, and I think we're years away, if ever, truly understanding the nature of human consciousness.
You know what it feels like to freely decide to come to a talk. Perhaps you don't because you're at school. I don't know if you've been forced to be here. But the position that you're sat in, maybe your legs crossed over another, you could choose at any moment to swap them over. And it feels like you have some agency over that. It feels like you're the author of that action, that if I rewound that clock, went back in time, you could have done something differently. And you could have done something differently based on your own decision-making, that you could have chosen to do that of your own accord. This is something like what free will is. It's a difficult thing to define precisely, but it's something like the ability to have acted differently if you were to rewind that clock.
So, this is a good place to pause and kind of kick off our discussion about the concept of free will. The definition of free will, the notion of what free will even is heavily debated. There are some who think the whole entire concept of free will is nonsensical. To even try to define it is nonsensical. But for our purposes here, we'll use a definition provided by Alex, which is the ability to have acted differently if you could rewind the clock. And we'll see where that analysis leads us. A really important thing to sort of prime for the rest of this discussion is this notion of being able to test whether or not we could have acted differently were we able to rewind the clock. Because for a number of reasons, we're going to see that notion is likely untestable, and we would never be able to create the environment or the testing conditions where we could even verify that. But we'll get into that in a little bit. Let's continue.
If you were to rewind that clock. And the reason that's a troublesome concept for many people is that anything that happens is going to happen for some kind of reason. Now, some people might object that some things might happen for no reason. There might be random events in the universe. Some of the most clever of you might be thinking of quantum physics, where we're told that there's random things happening all the time. You hear this kind of language. One thing to note is that if something is random, then by definition, you're not in control of it. And if something is genuinely random, there's no determinate factor, then you can't be in control of it because it's random. If you had some control over it, it wouldn't be random.
Okay, I don't think I'm going out on a limb here to say that the definition here of randomness is fair. I think those who follow this channel will understand that. For something to be truly random, it really means that there cannot be sort of any causal or deterministic influence on that thing. This is an important point. So if it's not understood, then hopefully this makes it clear. We're talking about complete randomness here. And for priming purposes for the rest of the discussion, you can think of Charles Darwin's insight on natural selection as sort of the events that contribute certainly to evolution, set aside for now whether to contribute to the origin of life. I think Darwin never intended to discuss that. He's been used in that way, but that's not what Darwin's work originally dealt with. But even with setting that to the side, the notion of evolution as being entirely random, uncaused, uninfluenced by any other factors but pure randomness, I think is the insight of Darwin and is how we should think of randomness for the purposes of this discussion. So let's keep going.
So there may be some randomness in the universe.
Sorry, I need to just interject a minor quibble here. Maybe it's major, but this notion that there may be some randomness in the universe is a certainly is a framing that Alex is entitled to. But I just want to say to sort of steelman the scientific um, evolutionary biologist physicist point of view is not that there may be randomness in the universe, but that the argument here, the truly scientific deterministic argument, is that the universe is entirely random and the events since at least the Big Bang are entirely random. Not maybe, not might be, but entirely random. This is going to be a really important point, but I don't want to spoil it until we get to it. I just want to flag that here before we continue.
But if some event is not random, what that means is that something has determined it to be the case. Something has made it so that this happened rather than that happened. If I flip a coin, it seems like that's random, and we often treat it like it's random, but technically speaking, it's not. If you could measure the exact force with which that coin was flipped into the air, its exact starting position, you knew the wind conditions, you knew every physical fact, you could predict with perfect accuracy which way it would land. Seems random, but it's not.
All right, I probably should let this go, but I can't for whatever reason. So just want to touch quickly here on the coin flip example. So Alex is totally correct. The flipping of a coin, whether it lands on heads or tails, might seem random, certainly at a macro level. But of course, if all of the variables that go into determining, you know, the velocity and torque and resistance and everything else that impacts that coin flip, if that could all be measured, then certainly which way the coin would land would not be considered random. And so, at the further we drill down with the more variables that we're able to understand, the less random that event truly would seem. That I totally agree with. I do want to just use a coin flip example to touch on one additional thing, because one of the questions that we're asking about free will as defined as the ability to have acted differently is where that coin is flipped. If I am on the person who has a choice of choosing between heads or tails, and I don't have all the information about the speed and the velocity and the angle and the resistance and everything else, could I choose heads or tails? Or am I somehow compelled, either by the random nature of all of the underlying components set in motion since the Big Bang that compelled me to that position? Am I somehow compelled to choose heads or tails there? Or do I have some inherent ability to make a choice there that is truly a choice? Could I have acted differently? We're going to talk about this in a bit more detail, but I think because the coin flip example came up, I feel like it's worth just putting that question out there as food for thought as we move forward here.
So what determines whether it lands heads or tails? Well, things like that, things like the force you give to it, things like the wind speed. These things are determining factors into flipping that coin around. And my position is that the things that happen inside of your brain are similar to this. Any event that happens inside of your head, that is, the motivation to switch your legs over, or the decision to raise your hand, or to put it down again. These are mental events. It comes from your brain. Your brain tells you to do this, or your brain tells your arm to go up and down. And the question you have to ask of any event, including mental events, is it determined or is it random? If it's random, if your brain just randomly does it, then you're definitely not in control of it because it's random. If it's not random, then it's determined by something. There's something that made you raise your hand.
All right, folks. So I have to pause here because this framing and I could be misunderstanding what Alex is trying to say. I don't think so, but I could be. This framing is wrong. And so what Alex has done here is he's drawn a a zero sum setup, which is that either actions are random or they are determined. That's not the zero sum here. The question is either are actions random or are they not random? And so that may sound like it's the same thing, but it's not. The determinist argument, the scientific argument for determinism, which is that all actions, all events, etc., that happen have been determined from the sort of beginning of space time. Since at least the foundation of the Big Bang, and you could separate out for the moment any form of creator or any form of concept prior to that. The concept of determination of determinism is that all of the subsequent events that have happened are entirely random, and that has to be the position in order for the truly uncaused scientific premises that flow from that to be able to flow. If there's a cause anywhere in the system, then if there's a cause anywhere on the system, then presumably that cause comes from outside of the system, and that's what scientists fundamentally reject. And for now, we're not going to sort of debate that here, but the determinist position, and Alex considers himself to be a determinist, is that all of the actions, the stuff that's going on within your brain that makes you raise your hand, the stuff that's going on within your brain that makes you cross your leg, the stuff that goes on in the air that determines which way the coin flips or lands. The determinist position, the scientific determinist position there is that everything that led to that is entirely random. And so when we're presenting a contrast for the purposes of free will, the contrast is not, is it random or is it determined? The contrast is it random or is it not random? Because the alternative point of view, and the point of view that certainly those from theological backgrounds take, and there are also, I should add, to be fair, there's also a viable and credible portion of the scientific community who also takes this position, is that the alternative is that the events are not random, and there is some ability to influence the system. And so, and you could think what we have at sort of, we froze a point in time with the potential, let's say there's a coin flip and we froze the moment where you have a chance to choose between heads or tails. There is a point of view that says there are two possibilities that are undetermined yet of what could happen in the future. One could be that the person chooses heads, another could be that the person chooses tails. And it's undetermined at the time in this hypothetical that we froze in time. The argument that the person who's arguing that events are non-random is saying is that there is a potential there for either of those events to happen. This is similar to the concept of a multiverse. This is similar to sort of other concepts like this. So the argument, and I've gone on long enough about this for now, but the argument here really is the choice for us to do anything purely random and determined, those are the same thing, or somehow not random. Okay, so that's enough of that rant for now.
Or maybe it's something else inside of your head. Maybe you raised your hand because you wanted to ask a question. So it's something inside of you. You wanted to ask a question. But then you've just pushed the problem back. And you ask of that mental event, you wanting to ask a question, that desire to ask a question, that itself is either determined or it's random. And again, if it's random, you're not in control of it. The desire just popped into your head and you had no control whatsoever over it. Okay, well, if it was determined by something, then once again, that thing will either be determined by something inside of your head, or eventually you'll go down this chain far enough and it will go somewhere outside of your head. Maybe you wanted to ask a question because your friend whispered in your ear and said, can you ask this for me, you know? And that's what caused you to do it. And if it comes from outside of you, then you're definitely not in control. So if any mental event, it's either going to terminate in randomness, which you're not in control of, or it's going to have some determinate cause, which will either itself terminate somewhere randomly in your mind, or eventually the causation will go so far back that it will go outside of yourself, outside of your brain. I hope that makes some sense. It's a complicated subject, but hopefully we can dig into it a bit more.
Okay, so that wraps up this particular portion of our analysis here, or at least of our discussion with Alex here on the concept of free will. We're going to move into two more clips after this that get closer to concepts related to Christianity, but it's important that we wrap this up by summarizing this notion of free will, because this concept of free will is really an important concept in the sort of grand scheme of things for someone who's on the journey to having faith in at least a Christian God and perhaps in anything. And so it is important for us to sort of understand where the atheist is coming from when they argue that there is no concept of free will. And so the first thing here, or maybe it's the last thing here, is to discuss that this notion of free will and understanding what free will is, in particular with the definition that we've chosen to use for the purposes of our example here, is inherently non-falsifiable. That is, the test that would need to be run to determine whether or not one could have acted differently if the clock was able to be rewound can't ever be run, and the specific set of circumstances that led to that particular choice can never be recreated. And so the determinist argues that all of our actions are based on a set of events that set forth a random um, chain of events from the beginning of space time, and there's no external causal actor or action on any of those things. So everything that we do, including me recording this audio here, has been predetermined since the beginning of time. So the if we get to the point now where I am now presented with a heads or tails choice, first the person choosing to flip the coin has been predetermined, and then my choice, even though I might believe that I am willingly and of my own volition choosing heads or tails, the determinist is saying no, you're not. Your choice there is based on a set of random events that have led you and essentially compelled you without agency to make the choice that you think is voluntary. Now, even setting aside our completely primitive understanding of consciousness that science may never have a grasp of, hopefully it's clear why that statement, whether it's true or not, that my decision to choose tails was predetermined, can never be tested scientifically. The scientific method requires us to essentially set up the set of circumstances to create a controlled environment where the identical set of circumstances is controlled for, and then measuring through a series of multiple tests whether or not we see the same thing or a different thing happening in that controlled set of circumstances. But in this case, we are unable to, and we will never be able to, recreate the exact set of circumstances that led to my decision to choose tails. And in fact, with what we know about the uncaused and predetermined random nature of events that scientists propose, is that every millisecond, every fraction of that, and every fraction of a fraction of a fraction of that is an entirely different controlled environment. The wind is slightly different. The temperature has slightly changed. The amount of entropy in the system has increased. The amount of heat may have dissipated. A number of things that make each subsequent moment different from the first. No two moments are identical. And so there's no way for us to set up an environment to say that where we're talking about completely random events for us to be able to know, well, could that person have acted differently if we were able to go back in time and control for that? We're not able to go back in time, and we're not even able to recreate the environment with 100% exactitude that we would need to be able to control for determining whether or not the action that followed was truly random. This may sound like a gotcha, but unfortunately for science, this is how it has to be done. Because the argument would be that if things are truly random in this way, that even small variations, you've heard of things like the black swan effect or the butterfly effect, even small variations may change what would have caused someone to choose heads or tails, and or any other even more complicated decision, cross their leg. So we have to actually recreate the controlled scenario exactly, and that's impossible. So the other argument here, the other aspect here is the question of whether or not our ability to even measure that, our ability to even set that environment up, even if we could hypothetically do it, would our influence on the system, our measurement itself, influence the outcome? And this is, if you remember, this is the Schrodinger's cat situation where prior to our observation, the there it's neither heads or tails. It's neither heads nor tails. As the coin is not the coin is in a sort of state of any of these possibilities, and there are some who reject that, but certainly an equal number, or certainly viable number who don't. And so this idea that we can falsify the concept of free will and know with certainty that we don't have it is false. It's inherently unfalsifiable. And so, for the purposes of us here, where we have one choice that cannot be falsified, which is the notion that we completely do not have free will, everything is random. Again, this is an untestable and unfalsifiable theory, which may be true, and certainly, if true, eliminates the need for having any kind of causal actor. And then we have the other side that says, no, we think there is a causation. There's some external creator or being or something else that's embedded us with the ability to have the choice, to be able to make the choice of acting differently. That is also not falsifiable. So whenever we have two non-falsifiable positions, all we're able to say is that either position is not definitively false. We can't sit here and say that it's definitively false that we have the ability to make our own choices and have acted differently. And we can't say that it's definitively true that that we do not. And so, because it's not definitively false, we have to entertain it as a possibility going forward. That's a long discussion. I hope that makes sense. We'll get into other aspects of this and how this relates to the journey that one undertakes to determine whether or not to have faith in anything. All right, so we're going to switch gears here a little bit, and we're going to get into the notion of the evidence supporting the claims in the Bible, particularly the claims in the Gospels. And we're going to talk about the the evidence that Alex O'Connor is relying on here to sort of reach the conclusion that he makes in this short clip. So let's get into it.
This to me does seem a little bit suspicious. It does seem to me suspicious, for example, that the Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest Gospel, contains no post-resurrection appearances. And then the Gospel of Matthew does include post-resurrection appearances. The Gospel of Luke includes even more. It's only in the Gospel of John that we get, for instance, Doubting Thomas, which is the latest Gospel, canonical Gospel, I should say. That's where that arises. And in fact, the story of Doubting Thomas, famously, he doesn't believe that it's the risen Christ. And Jesus says, "Come and touch my wounds." And he touches his wounds and he says, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus says, "You believe because you've seen. Blessed are those who believe without seeing." So in my view, what we have is this so-called mythological development of no post-resurrection appearances. And as the time goes on, as we get further away from the source, the stories get more fantastical, ending in a moral lesson to believe without evidence. Seeing. Yes. This to
So I'm often asked why Markan priority versus Matthean priority matters. And there are a number of answers to that. But one of the things I want to touch on here is the layering on of assumptions that come from the factually unsupported position that Mark was first. This is something I harp on this channel, and I think if you haven't had a chance to see the previous videos, I'll link some in the description. But I think the point where we're at now is we can say definitively this is not an opinion. Please do not try to argue that this is an opinion. The case for Markan priority is factually and evidentiarily unsupported. There's no support for it. Now, that may seem controversial, and it doesn't mean that Mark wasn't first, but the evidence that we have for Markan priority, it's just not there. I've gone through this. There is no evidence. If there is evidence, please bring it forth. We're at the point now where the burden is on you. I've done my part. There is no argument that Mark was first. There's no evidence supporting that position at all. Okay? Zero. So if that's at all ambiguous to you, you need to go back and look at what I've done, or bring me the evidence that said, hey, you're totally wrong about this, and here's the proof. We found the fragment, we found the missing carbon dating information, and here's what it shows. Or here's this long lost document where this historian from antiquity, first century, said Mark was first. Bring it, because without that, there's no grounding evidentiarily to put Mark first. And in fact, what we have is the opposite. All of the evidence that we are allowed to look at puts Matthew first. The reason why this matters is because you see the faulty conclusions that flow from going in the other direction. So one of the arguments here is that there's been this growth of resurrection narratives from Mark to Matthew. Now, I've talked elsewhere about the really dubious claim that even if Mark was first, that there was some growth in resurrection accounts from Mark to Matthew, because as we know, the ending of Mark is contested. I'm not sitting here saying that the current ending of Mark is the wrong ending. I'm not saying it's the right ending. I'm saying it's contested, and there are lots of people who look at this. What we have is from our earliest documents, the earliest accounts that have an intact Gospel of Mark. In this case, we're talking at least as early as Tatian's Diatessaron in the 2nd century, have the longer ending of Mark in those accounts. The earliest surviving accounts of Mark contain the longer ending of Mark that contains verses 9 through 20 from chapter 16. Now, it is also true that the earliest extant gospel manuscripts, those existing outside something like the Diatessaron, the earliest intact Gospel of Mark manuscripts from the 4th century do not have the longer ending. But those manuscripts come some 200 years later from that of Tatian. And so what does that tell us? It doesn't mean that Tatian is original. It doesn't mean that the accounts from the extant manuscripts are not accurate. But what it says is that at least as early as the 2nd century, there was a longer ending of Mark that was at least in circulation somewhere. It's contested. It is intellectually dishonest to argue that Mark does not include resurrection accounts and use that as some basis to make additional claims about the notion of resurrection in Mark. Mark does forecast the resurrection. It's mentioned and discussed and forecasted, and Jesus is risen in Mark. However, the actual accounts that are seen in verses 9 through 20 are absent from at least the earliest extant surviving intact manuscript of the Gospel of Mark. It's an important factual point to get on record, because when we're looking at a historical record, one thing that's different about this case with Mark versus that from, say, the arguments for Matthew is that we do have evidence here that predates the evidence that's being used to say that Mark doesn't contain the longer ending. We do have evidence here that's earlier that at least casts doubt upon that. And that's as far as I'm willing to go. I'm not going to sit in here and argue right now that that Tatian's diatessaron, for example, which looks at Mark and has the longer ending, is the correct version. That's not the point. So enough on that. That's the first bit of this. The second part here, though, is that by putting Mark first, that's the only way you can see this pattern. If Matthew is first, and again, that's the only position we are allowed to take with the evidence of the record that we have. We are not permitted, with the evidence that we have, to put Mark first. So I'm going to underline that again. We're not permitted to take that position evidentiarily with what we currently have. Okay? Barring some other breakthrough finding, we're just simply not permitted to put Mark first. And so if we do the correct thing that the evidence compels us to do and put Matthew first, then this growth of resurrection accounts story goes away, because Matthew has a robust set of resurrection accounts. So it's just these kinds of little things that getting the priority issue wrong lead to. And this can easily lead to doubts amongst a non-believer or someone who's on the faith journey, as it did for me, because it raised questions to me about whether Matthew was based on a truly eyewitness account or not. It raised questions to me about the earliness of the accounts, etc. And so just want to sort of pause on that point. The second thing we want to discuss here is this issue of Thomas. And we're not going to get into all of the theology here, but there's a point that's important to make in this analysis, which started from this concept of free will versus determinism, that then moved to this issue of the resurrection accounts, and now is moving into this discussion of Thomas. Each of these little pieces contributes to someone who's seeking into having doubt about whether or not we can rely on any of this as being true or not. With respect to Thomas, the point I want to make here is that Alex has it wrong in terms of Jesus' lesson being one should believe without evidence. The gospel narratives with respect to Thomas in the Gospel of John, talk about the other apostles having seen Jesus and presenting their evidence, their testimony. Hey, we saw the risen Jesus. And Thomas saying, I don't believe that until I see for myself. And it's in that backdrop that Jesus says, you believe because you have seen. Blessed are those who believe without seeing. But what Jesus is saying, or what Jesus is not saying, let me back up. Jesus is not saying in this circumstance that blessed are those who believe without any evidence. What Jesus is saying is, blessed are those who believe with the evidence that you had prior to seeing, the testimony, the conviction of your brothers and sisters. Blessed are those who can believe based upon that and don't need to actually physically touch. There are a number of theological reasons. I'm not equipped to fully do the theology justice here, but there are a number of theological reasons that I can see as a reader for why Jesus would want to make that point. You know, because if Jesus is God, and I believe Jesus is, then Jesus knows that the future generations are only going to have the evidence that Thomas had prior to touching, the testimony, the testimonials, the witness accounts, and they're not going to have anything else. And from Jesus' perspective, that's sufficient evidence, given everything else upon which one can base their faith on the rest. There are a number of reasons why Jesus didn't just come down crashing and banging with lightning and showing his apostles from day one, look at all these whiz bang things that I can do that prove I'm God. There's a reason for why. It's not for me to understand, and I think I can certainly explain it if I need to, maybe in another video, why Jesus didn't do that. But Jesus did also understand that the rest of the world, the rest of the people following on, would be Thomas's without the ability to touch. That's not the same as saying that there is the expectation of believing without evidence. So enough on that, and we're going to move on here to the last of the 3 videos. I'm going to let this last video play in full before discussing it, because I think this video perfectly encapsulates how all of these little things lead to someone who's seeking and trying to understand toward giving up, as it were.
G.K. Chesterton said, Christianity has not been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and not tried. You know, because to really be a Christian is a difficult thing to do. It's a difficult life philosophy to adopt. It demands a lot of you. It demands a lot of personal sacrifice. It demands a lot of moral transformation. If you're a proud person, you have to get rid of that. If you're a rich person, Jesus isn't very fond of being rich. The rich man comes to Jesus and says, Lord, I've done everything. I've followed the laws. I've followed all the commandments. And Jesus says, there's one thing you haven't done. Go home, sell all of your possessions. And the man goes away with a saddened heart. He's just spoken to Jesus, who's told him that you can join the eternal life crew, baby. And even then, the man's saddened, because he knows it's a big sacrifice he's going to have to make. So it's not an easy feat, you know. But I think there's only a certain degree of, like, you can say, well, try being a Christian, but there are a certain action or certain ways of trying on a worldview that you can only really do if you believe it already.
All right, folks, so we'll wrap up on this. And I find that more than anything else we've discussed today from Alex, this point of view is the one that I connect with personally the most. I try not to get too personal here. It's just a preference of mine. I have shared and do occasionally share personal testimonials. I try to separate the content when I'm doing that so it's clear where I'm going full-fledged Christian versus when I'm trying to be the logician that's helping us understand the evidence. But in this circumstance, there's a part of this that I totally relate to from Alex that appeals to sort of my logical side. And I remember having these same feelings and this same analysis. And it starts with the idea that Christianity is hard. I'm not the best person to discuss that, whether that's true or not, and certainly not with all of my faults, I'm not the right person to tell anyone whether or not, hey, just do it or just don't do it, or it's easy or it's not easy. Everyone's circumstances are different, but this is a point of view that for someone who's seeking, for someone who has doubts, for someone who is unsure whether there's a point to anything, this can make it hard for that person to want to take the plunge, because there are some things that and adjustments that you'd have to make in your life, or at least try to make, and hold a standard you'd have to hold yourself to that you won't be able to maintain forever. And I think that's an important side point here, which is that no Christian can maintain the standard of Jesus' perfection forever. That's the entire point of acknowledging the fact that we are sinners and imperfect and everything else. But setting that aside, even trying to get on that path and trying to walk that sort of narrow path, as it were, can be daunting. And it's especially daunting if you don't have a good reason to. And so where I want to close off with is the point that Alex makes at the end of the video, which is saying to someone, hey, just try it. Just try on Christianity. What do you have to lose? This is it's a pretty difficult request to ask if you don't have a reason to believe that there's any reason to believe that any of the evidence we have from the Gospels is true. And again, I say this personally as someone who was in this position. Like if what we've been given from the Gospel accounts is completely made up, decades later, centuries later, even in some arguments, not true, myth, legend, grown out of thin air, influenced by the Greeks and Flavius Josephus and Tacitus and the Romans and everything else, and just completely made up, then to say, hey, just go try this is asking a lot, and it's actually, for someone who thinks logically as Alex does and who is analytical in the way Alex is, that's not going to be enough. That's not going to work. And so what the job is for someone like me is to try to lay out the evidence that we have. And again, the evidence may be compelling to different people to different levels, but to lay out the evidence that we have and to really push back aggressively. And if you've not seen already, I have a resentment for a large swath of the Religious Studies Academy for not doing this job, because what I think there is a way to approach this work that doesn't require the academy to entertain any and all faulty assumptions and any and all faulty analysis the way they do. It's almost as if anything that goes toward disproving the Gospels, disproving the evidence that's within them. I'm talking historically. I'm not even talking on a supernatural level. Anything that goes toward that is allowed to pass with minimal pushback. Then anything that's advanced that seems to want to go in any other direction of either validating the accounts or authenticating them, or even worse, venturing into the supernatural, is viciously attacked by the academy. That's not the job of scholars. That's not their job. Their job is to look at the evidence and go where the evidence leads, wherever it leads. That's the job of scholarship in any field. And so I see as my limited role here with my small little footprint to point out the evidence that is good evidence, attack evidence that is bad evidence, put the burdens where they need to be put for different arguments, and hold the scholarly community accountable. Because allowing things like Markan priority, for example, faulty gospel dating, wild and fantastic theories about gospel authorship, etc. Allowing those things to go unchallenged and to be accepted as some form of established fact based on nothing but quote unquote scholarly consensus, where there is no rigorous process to get to that consensus. It's just, yep, we agree, it aligns with our convictions, so we accept it. Where that's the scholarly consensus, it's my job to push back against that and demand the evidence and shift the burden back to the scholars to provide that for us. And so I want to wrap up here by saying that where I think the academy, writ large, and this is not everybody, right? So I make these statements broadly sometimes, but of course this doesn't apply to everybody. Where the Religious Studies Academy has really failed is for people like Alex, who I think are at some level, at least at some point in their journey, were genuinely seeking to understand the truth, and they were owed a fair shot at getting there. They may have looked at it and said, "This isn't enough for me. I can't get there," but they were owed a fair shot, and that's not what they were given. What they were given instead was a bunch of completely unchecked, unscrutinized, wild claims that go in the direction of discounting the all the fundamentals of the stories of the Gospels. And so, for someone outside the field like Alex to look at that, it's understandable why they may have doubts. And so, I empathize with this because if someone in this position could get to the point of saying, well, I mean, at least there's some evidence here that these events happened. At least the natural events happened. If they can at least get to that point, then they can look at the rest of and then understand some of the arguments we made earlier about free will and the rest. Then they could look at this and say, you know what? Given the choice of the totally absurd position, and it is absurd, by the way, to take the position of pure determinism, um, because a purely deterministic position, the non-falsifiable deterministic position, uh, is first of all certain death, purposelessness. There's no moral accountability, etc. These are all unavoidable. We can have another conversation about those, but that's where it leads. And again, if that can't be falsified, it's nonsensical to take that position when you could take another also non-falsifiable position, which is that perhaps there's something higher and there is a purpose and there's something after this. That position becomes less nonsensical if the underlying evidence can help support it. And so that's the goal that I have, and that's the goal of this channel. I think I've gone on long enough. Hopefully that got through to somebody, and I thank you for taking the time to listen.